This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm your host, Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. My guest is Ann Reynolds, Vice President for Offshore Wind with American Clean Power, the wind industry's national advocacy group. As founder of the New York Offshore Wind Alliance and director of New York's Alliance for Clean Energy, Ann was pivotal in the emergence of the state's now U.S. pace-setting offshore wind industry. Before bringing her skills to goal-achieving action to the national stage, Ann also helped state clean energy agencies. In this USA podcast, Ann's going to talk about the emergence of offshore wind as a major factor in the United States power mix, its accomplishments, its very real near-term challenges, and its next big growth steps. And offshore wind was 19% of advanced U.S. clean energy development in 2023 and is becoming a power sector force with major investment around the world. China and the UK are setting a remarkable growth pace. And U.S. Department of Interior is rapidly moving on site approvals off New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Pacific coasts. So can you introduce our listeners to offshore wind's new place in the U.S. energy mix?
Sure, and thank you for having me in that kind introduction. We think offshore wind's the next major energy source. We need more electricity in the United States. We need it close to where people live and work, like the coasts, and we need it to be clean and emissions-free, especially in states that have made ambitious commitments to cleaning the electricity sector. So if you look at all those factors, what you're left with is offshore wind. You mentioned New York State. We started the New York Offshore Wind Alliance because we looked at the climate goals and we came to the conclusion that we cannot meet those climate goals without offshore wind energy. And that's why I've become such an enthusiastic advocate for it. We need a reliable electricity system, and this is going to be a key piece of that puzzle in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And it offers something that onshore wind doesn't offer, which is a much higher capacity factor. The wind blows over the oceans a lot more than a lot of places on land. But there are, it seems like, near-term obstacles. Global offshore wind leader Orsted has moved away from major projects, including the 1,100 megawatt Ocean Wind 1 and 2 proposals. Some analysts have reduced their 2030 growth projections. The Biden administration is reportedly about to reduce its 2030 offshore wind goal because of rising costs from state incentive policy complexities, supply chain disruptions, and high interest rates. So how is the wind industry, the offshore wind industry, responding to these challenges?
Yeah, I'd say in the words of Dickens, it's been the best of times, it's been the worst of times in 2023. I mean, we had real progress. There's projects under construction now. And for those of us who have been advocating for offshore wind, it's so satisfying to see Vineyard Wind and South Fork under construction. But it was a tough year for projects. They ran into some macroeconomic headwinds because the price of building these projects increased, construction costs, the commodities that go into them, the turbines themselves. And in the case of offshore wind, these contract prices were locked in several years back, before COVID, before the inflation that followed COVID, and before the interest rate increases that followed inflation. So all those had a dramatic impact on project economics. The projects that started construction or were well on their way before those dynamics are the ones we're seeing reaching completion now. The ones that hadn't started that, had not locked in contracts for purchasing their turbines, have been struggling. And as you mentioned, several of them have turned back their contracts. The good news is the states that are driving this market, and I love that you describe New York as US pace setting, they're remaining committed. And so they're rebidding projects. They're maintaining the competitive nature of the bidding process in New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts, Connecticut. And some of these projects are getting recontracted. Probably not all of them. Did it set us back in time? For sure. But I think we're seeing a resetting of the offshore wind industry that ultimately will be very healthy.
Interesting. And these problems that you mentioned, they're not specific to the offshore wind industry. These aren't problems with the industry itself. These are problems with that are economy wide, right?
Yeah, for sure. The same inflation that American families face were faced by these projects. It's just that some of the commodities or some of the cost centers for these projects, like cement, labor, steel, copper, increased more than general inflation. And in part, that's because there was so much demand for these projects, which is the good news. Also, Europe
Hmm.
doubled down on its goals with the war in Ukraine as they tried to free themselves from Russian gas. So there were factors that popped up unexpectedly. It's part of the risk in developing a brand new industry, and it resulted in the growing pains you've described. But I think the outlook is still positive.
Right. And just real quick, Vineyard Wind, and you mentioned another project. Where are those? Those are I think Vineyard is off Massachusetts.
Yeah.
There are projects that are nearing completion, well along in progress. Where are they? Just very briefly.
So Vineyard Wind is feeding into Massachusetts. South Fork Wind is close to Vineyard, but actually feeding into the eastern end of Long Island. So it's feeding in New York, contracted with the Long Island Power Authority. Both of those projects are nearly completed in terms of turbine installations. In fact, both of them are already sending electricity to shore. On their heels is Revolution Wind. They're doing some onshore construction, and Coastal Virginia project is not quite doing offshore construction yet, but onshore construction is underway.
Something people don't often think about. Those are all very adjacent to big population centers. Um, Now, onshore wind's growth has long come from the federal production tax credit, but the Inflation Reduction Act moved offshore wind to the 30% investment tax credit, or ITC, which the wind industry has long proposed. Um, I see three questions here that are interrelated that I want to ask you. What's the difference between these two kinds of tax credits? Is federal guidance on the IRA's new ITC complete? And how will this ITC impact offshore wind growth?
Yeah, sure. So the Inflation Reduction Act, definitely a game changer. As you mentioned, the industry has been depending on the production tax credit for many years. But now for offshore wind, we have an investment tax credit that's permanent. It's not phasing out 3 years from now, which is extremely important because these projects take longer than that to develop. So the most important thing is they now have this certainty. It's also an investment tax credit, which is important for projects that have such intense capital investment up front. We are still waiting for some guidance from US Treasury about some of those adders. How can these projects get more than 30%? And Congress, in their wisdom, decided if the projects were in energy communities, some think of them as they've hosted energy infrastructure in the past, or maybe they've been disadvantaged in another way, brownfields, for example, contaminated land, or the use of domestic content. And so American Clean Power and the offshore wind industry has been weighing in on trying to make the guidance about those two components of the investment tax credit work to really move projects ahead in ways that help project economics. And that will reduce the cost on ratepayers in the states that are buying power from these projects. So we're still waiting for some guidance, and we hope to see it in the coming months.
Yeah, we are all hoping to see it in the coming months. The and for listeners, the USEA Power Sector Podcast is going to dig quite a bit deeper into the IRA and the guidance on the IRA in future episodes. But let's go back to offshore wind. On the West Coast, offshore wind is behind the East Coast because, unlike the Atlantic coast, the Pacific continental shelf drops off really sharply, and that makes it cost prohibitive to anchor turbines to the seabed like they're being anchored in the Atlantic in the East. But California is preparing to lead the way on something called floating offshore wind technology. And how do you float 10 megawatt wind turbines that are three times the height of the Statue of Liberty? And um, and what do you make of the stakeholder efforts in California to repurpose existing transmission from retiring nuclear and natural gas plants. Is that a new idea that is going to work really well?
I hope so on the second, but first back to floating wind. Yes, it's exciting. It's the next frontier in offshore wind development. It works similarly to floating oil and gas platforms, and these
Mm.
very large structures will be secured in place through cable moorings, but essentially they are floating and they're going to be spinning and producing electricity. And they have to do it that way on the West Coast because of the depths. So we should think of that as an opportunity that California can lead the way. California and hopefully Oregon and Washington too can lead the way in becoming a center for floating wind technology. There's projects in Europe, one off Portugal, one off Scotland, for example. So it's not completely new, but it's definitely newer technology than the fixed bottom projects. And in terms
And
of
but as you go ahead, sorry to interrupt.
Sure. In terms of the using existing infrastructure, for example, there's lease areas now close to the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant. And that has been
Mhm.
the subject of discussions of phasing that out over years. When exactly that will happen is the business of California. But if that interconnection point can be reused, it's definitely cheaper and more efficient for the offshore wind projects. They're doing the same on the East Coast too, that for example, an offshore wind project feeding into New York is planning on using an interconnection point for Ravenswood, which is the largest fossil fuel plant in New York City. So it's really possible to reuse that infrastructure in an efficient way to bring down the cost of these new generating facilities.
Which and which does gives the new offshore wind potential a lower overall cost and a lower overall environmental footprint, which are things that we have to consider in the 21st century. And we just have a few minutes left. I want to get to one more question. I've heard some concerns recently about slowed growth because of an antiquated federal law called the Jones Act. What is the Jones Act? Is it a real impediment to offshore wind growth? And are there fixes for it that you're working on? What's happening with that?
The Jones Act was enacted in 1920, so it's been around for a long time, and it requires that merchandise transported on sea between U.S. ports use U.S. owned, U.S. built, and U.S. crewed vessels. So I would describe it as a challenge for the offshore wind industry, but not a law that the industry is attempting to change. We're going to work with
Hmm.
the Jones Act, and it makes things more complicated or complicated in some cases. In the vineyard wind construction, for example, a lot of the components are ferried out to the construction site by U.S. flagged vehicles, and then they are transferred to the construction vessels. But the important thing to note is that there's already 30 new domestic offshore wind vessels that the industry is investing in. That's good news for shipbuilding locations in the U.S. And they're things like crew transfer vessels, service vessels, some installation vessels. The larger, very niche construction vessels are going to be slower to arrive because in order to build a vessel like that, you have to know you have a long pipeline of projects because it's very expensive infrastructure. But that's where we want to get. The answer to the Jones Act is to make these vessels in the US, and we have to figure out how to do it in the short term before they are all made in the US. But the industry has made the decision that the Jones Act is not something that we're currently trying to change.
That's exciting news. That means a whole new job sector, a whole new set of jobs. Just like solar brought solar installers, and the wind industry has provided this enormous job opportunity for turbine technicians. Whole new set of opportunities for Americans who want to do something for their country and for the climate. And I got to thank you very much, Vice President for Offshore Wind for American Clean Power. Thank you for detailing the emergence of offshore wind as a major factor in the power mix and the obstacles it faces and how it plans to face down those obstacles. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.